Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's web seminar on the Homeless Emergency Aid Program, California's newest strategy to address youth homelessness. My name is Amy Lemley. I'm with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and we're really delighted to be able to share this information with you today. We're right at 10 o'clock, and per our usual process, we like to give people a minute or two to join, get their coffee, get situated. And so we'll be back in just a minute or two to jump into today's content. Thank you. All right. Again, thank you, everyone, for being on today's web seminar. We're really excited to have time to talk about this today. Again, the web seminar is the Homeless Emergency Aid Program, California's newest strategy to address youth homelessness. Today, we are going to spend about an hour and a half, about an hour likely on the content, and another half an hour addressing your questions and answers. And we're really delighted to be joined by a number of presenters. First, we're going to hear from Ginny Puttyfoot. Ginny is the Executive Director of the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council. Prior to that, Ginny was Assistant Deputy Director at the California Department of Housing and Community Development's Division of Financial Assistance. And prior to that was the Federal Legislative Coordinator for the California Department of Social Services. Many of us know Ginny from the over 10 years she spent in senior research and policy with the California Research Bureau, where she founded and directed the California Homeless Youth Project. So we're delighted Ginny can be here with us today. Following Ginny, we're going to hear from Eric Hubbard. Eric is the Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships at HOMELESSNESS, Inc., based in Los Angeles. Eric graduated from Occidental College with a politics major and has a wide range of responsibilities at HOMELESSNESS. He has served as the elected representative of the Boyle Heights, East LA, Los Angeles Continuum of Care Coordinating Council, and most recently is playing a central role in executing the LA Taco Festival. For those of you in the LA area, it draws thousands of people from around the county to learn more about youth homelessness and get engaged in the issue. And then next we'll hear from Sharon Report, who's the Associate Director of the Corporation for Supportive Housing's California Policy Program. Now, in her role, Sharon works to develop and advocate for policies to prevent and end homelessness. I've had the pleasure of working closely with Sharon on a number of pieces of legislation, and she has really worked in her role at CSH to sponsor and pass landmark legislation, including legislation authorizing the state to create a Medi-Cal health home for frequent hospital users, and in the field of child welfare has been very active in ensuring there's access to safe, affordable housing for families who are seeking reunification. So we really have a great lineup today to talk about this program and to talk about a few ways that we are hoping it can be implemented in the state. So before we get into it, I just want to say a few words that, if you are hearing me, you likely figured out the whole audio portion of the web seminar. As always, we are going to present all of our materials and a recording of the audio on our website under Research and Training, under the Training Archive. And, what makes this most interesting is your questions. We're absolutely thrilled about the timing of this. It's a very good time for questions to be asked. And so please don't wait until the end to send those in. My colleague Simone is right here capturing everything. We're going to be organizing those, prioritizing those, and getting through as many in rapid-fire succession as we can. So please do send in your questions, and we'll get as most out of our time together as we can. So now for the agenda, we're going to start with Ginny, who's really going to give us a breakdown of this exciting new program available at the state level. We're then going to turn to Eric, who's going to talk about one potential way to use that funding, which is rapid rehousing, specifically a approach to rapid rehousing called college-focused rapid rehousing. Then we're going to turn it over to Sharon, who's really going to help us understand how permanent supportive housing is an approach that could be used, that could access HEAP funding, and specifically around the issue of youth. I'm going to take it over from there and just break it down, like what are the steps to get started. We've got a very diverse group of people on today's web seminar. I'm not sure how many we have, but over 500 registered. For some of you, you're at the highest levels of sophistication in terms of knowledge of affordable housing, continuums of care, state funding. Others are in a different place. And so the goal in that last agenda item is to give everyone practical, actionable information so that wherever you are, you can know how to access this funding. And then we'll wrap it up with question and answer. But before we turn over to Jenny, one last issue is really a thank you. Now, nothing like as big and significant as HEAP comes about because of any single person. And yet the people on this screen were really our elected officials who dug deep and made this possible. Certainly Governor Brown, who signed the legislation, Senate Bill 850. Senator Scott Wiener is really leading, I would say, the state in ensuring that California develops a approach to youth homelessness. Assemblymember Phil Ting was the budget chair this year. Certainly this couldn't have been possible without him prioritizing this, along with Senators Bell and Skinner. You know, this is really the tip of the iceberg. Many, many people, elected officials, advocates, legislative staff, and of course, those of you on this call. I mean, you're the ones who wrote letters, went to committee hearings, called your elected officials, and together it resulted in $500 million to address homelessness in California. Now, $500 million isn't what it used to be. I mean, it sure would have been great for it to be $2 billion. And part of this conversation today is to how do we keep the conversation going and how do we keep working together. We know we have the leadership at the state level who wants to keep working on this. And the best, way in the short term is to use what we've got. And so that's a good way to segue over to Ginny. So thank you again, Ginny. I know you are extremely busy right now working with your colleagues to establish this program, implement it, doing trainings all across the state. We appreciate that you took time today to be on today's web seminar and to share information about HEAP.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Amy. I'm really delighted to be here. This is a very exciting moment for us at the council because just yesterday, in fact, we did issue the NOFA application for our HEAP program. But before turning to HEAP, I wanted to just spend a moment talking about what the California Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council is. We're a newly established council within the California Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency. And the council was established in 2016 by Senator Mitchell and has a membership of up to 19 members. In this last budget cycle, SB 850 made significant changes to the council by transferring it from the Department of Housing and Community Development to the Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency, and designating our secretary as chair and providing permanent staff, one of whom is me. Most significantly for this conversation, SB 850 also added 2 new council members, one of whom is a formerly homeless youth who resides in California. So that's exciting news, I think, for all of us who are engaged in addressing youth homelessness. The council meets quarterly, and the meetings are open to the public. And please see our website for any and all information about the Council and also the new funding program, HEAP. Our next meeting is in October 9th, in Los Angeles on October 9th. And one of the primary focuses of that meeting will be youth homelessness. Next slide, please. So moving now to HEAP, SB 850 established the Homeless Emergency Aid Program, which, as Amy said, is a $500 million one-time flexible block grant program. And the funds are intended to assist local communities in addressing their immediate homelessness challenges. It is one time, it's flexible, and so it's really focused on immediate emergency needs. As you can see from this slide, the funding is divided into three categories. One of these categories, the middle, 150 million, is going to be allocated to the 11 largest cities that have populations of 330,000 or more. And it's based on a proportionate share of the homeless population in those cities. The other two pots of money, the 100 million at the top and the 250 million at the bottom, will be allocated to continuums of care based on two different formula allocations. One is based on the total homeless population in the latest point-in-time count, and the other is based on a range of the homeless individuals in the point-in-time count. Next slide, please. So this is a slide just to illustrate the 11 large cities with populations over 330,000, as you can see here. And I am so thrilled to say that yesterday, as I mentioned, we issued the NOFA application. And as of last night, we have already received applications from two of these 11 cities, Oakland and San Diego. So that's good news for us, and we're looking forward to receiving additional applications soon. Next slide, please. There are actually two separate applications in line with the two different kinds of entities that are eligible to apply. All of the materials are on our website. And as I said, we are accepting on a rolling basis and we'll be processing on a rolling basis. Next slide, please. So there are really two requirements that applicants, both large cities and continuums of care, must adhere to in order to get funding from HEAP. One is a shelter crisis declaration, and this is a requirement that cities and counties are required to enact if they want a share of the funding from HEAP. So it's a resolution that must be adopted by the governing body of a jurisdiction or jurisdictions within a continuum of care or by a large city. It's not that every city or county within a COC must declare a shelter crisis, but in order to receive a share of funds, a shelter crisis declaration is required. The only exception to that is that for continuums of care with fewer than 1,000 homeless individuals, those COCs are exempt from this requirement. Next slide, please. The other requirement for receiving HEAP funds is that applicants must engage in a collaborative process with the stakeholders within their communities. Collaboration is required in order to determine how HEAP funds will be allocated within the COC or large city. And we're not being prescriptive about what that collaborative process must look like, because each COC and city has a governance structure that differs. But it must, in order to consider an application complete, each applicant must provide some form of documentation that a collaborative process has taken place. That can include public meetings, task force meetings, letters of support, and homelessness plans. Next slide, please. So the allowable uses for HEAP funding are intentionally broad. Unlike a lot of different grant programs, the intent here was to provide flexible funding that could be used by communities to really address the needs locally. We're encouraging applicants to think creatively and craft programs and services that are most needed within their communities. Generally speaking, we see the allowable uses in 3 categories: services, rental assistance, and capital improvements. However, any use that can be demonstrated to be targeted to assisting homeless individuals or individuals at imminent risk of homelessness are eligible for funding. One of the most important aspects of this for our conversation today is that at least 5% of funds must be used to address youth homelessness, and that is something I know we'll talk more about shortly. And no more than 5% of funds can be used for administrative costs. It's also the case that these funds can't be used for overhead planning, development of a homeless management information system, or other sort of ancillary services. Next slide, please. I won't spend much time on this slide. This schedule is available on our website, and essentially what's important about this is the commitment that the council has to allocate funds as quickly as possible. We are committed to actually allocating funds to communities within 60 days of receipt of a completed application. And so those applicants that applied yesterday can expect to receive funds within 60 days of yesterday. And as you can see, we've divided funding up into 2 rounds, and within each round, an early review period, and then when the actual deadline is. We're encouraging COCs and cities to apply in round 1 in order to ensure they get a full share of their allocated funding. Next slide, please. HEAP does have some spending and reporting requirements and deadlines because it is intended to be one-time flexible emergency aid. There is a requirement that 50% of program funds be contractually obligated by January 1st, 2020, and that 100% of program funds be spent no later than June 30th, 2021. There are some reporting requirements that will be defined and agreed to by COCs and cities when they sign their contract with us for receipt of funds. And you can see those on the screen there, some of them. And it's important to know that funds that aren't spent by that June 30th, 2021 deadline will be returned to us and revert to the general fund. Next slide, please. So this is the important slide, I think, for this conversation. How does HEAP address youth homelessness? And as I said, no less than 5% must be used to provide supports and services for homeless youth. And the language is clear about it being used to establish or expand services, and also to include the needs of youth who are at risk of homelessness. So one of the things that we have been emphasizing in our workshops is that 5% is a floor, not a ceiling, and that it really must be used to establish and expand services. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much,
Is that the end of
Jenny.
my slide? Yep. All right. Thank you, Amy.
Absolutely, and the questions are pouring in for you, Jenny. So rest for a little bit because there's lots of good questions about the specifics of the program. And so, you've heard from Jenny. There's a lot of flexibility in this program, and that is by design. It's not prescriptive at the state level. The whole intention is to meet the local needs. And so you might ask, well, given that, why are we taking this time to emphasize two approaches? Why are we talking about and really encouraging people to think about using HEAP for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing? The reality is, for homeless youth in California, there has been very little funding for the full continuum of housing interventions. There's been very little funding, frankly, for anything. But these areas in particular. And so over time, what our organization and many of the sponsors of SB 918 and others are working towards the development of a full continuum of housing strategies for homeless youth. We know that homeless youth are not any single thing. Some need shelter, some need a short-term rental subsidy, some are going to need permanent supportive housing. There's a lot of different approaches. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And so we're looking forward to, together, using this fund to see that continuum of needs addressed. These two approaches are particularly appealing, first because, as you see on the slide, they comply with the housing first requirements of Senate Bill 1380. As Jenny stated, that's the legislation that established the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council, and its initial charge was to ensure that all housing programs in California that use state funds take a housing first approach. And we could talk a lot about housing first. I know in her comments, Sharon's going to be addressing this, but in a nutshell, it's an approach that instead of making people housing ready and then giving them housing, it's an approach where we start with housing, couple it with supportive services, but that we move into an approach where housing is offered sooner rather than later, actually immediately. And so that's really a requirement of programs funded in the state of California, and each of these models does comply with that, so that makes it very appealing. Both these models are also well developed, well documented. You know, we're not reinventing the wheel. These are things, there's lots of technical assistance materials, there's lots of support materials to implement them. There's also a lot of evidence that they reduce homelessness. I don't think any of us want to treat anyone as a guinea pig. We want to use evidence-based interventions and know that where our scarce public resources are being invested are in interventions that are going to translate into outcomes. And then the last one is not insignificant. These are all approaches that are funded by HUD. Some things HUD funds, some things it doesn't. But HUD is the main game in town for funding for homelessness, youth homelessness and adult homelessness. And so if you're developing an approach that isn't funded by HUD, it doesn't have much of a shelf life. And I say that, understanding that sometimes we have kind of legacy programs. They are what they are. But if we're thinking about how to use new funding, how to really use this as a catalyst to launch something new, let's align it with models that are currently funded by HUD. And so for the first one is, again, it's the core rapid rehousing program with a modification to really think about the higher education needs of homeless youth. And I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to Eric. Eric, thank you very much for being on today's web seminar.
Happy to be here. Again, my name is Eric Hubbard. I'm our Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships for HOMELESSNESS, Inc. And I'll get a little bit more into what our agency does in a little bit, but I want to just take some time to explain what rapid rehousing is. Rapid rehousing is a rental subsidy model that allows youth to move into permanent housing, typically a market rate apartment, while receiving support as in the forms of rental subsidies and case management, as well as move-in assistance. And so at HOMELESSNESS, we've been using rapid rehousing since 2014 as a way to increase the stock of housing opportunities that our youth are able to access. We know that it takes a long time to build housing, as we've done that before, and we know that youth have many different needs, very different reasons that they become homeless in the first place, and very different solutions that can help them leave homelessness behind for good. And so ever since we've been working with rapid rehousing, we've really been able to start developing more connections with landlords in our communities and move youth into an apartment of their own that they can stay in, that they gradually take over the cost of the lease over time, and they're able to maintain that apartment once the subsidy ends. Generally speaking, when we started working with RAP Rehousing, the way it would work is that we would work with the youth to identify an apartment, so they'd be learning about the apartment search as our case manager works with them. We look for apartments that are going to be affordable for the youth, considering that they'll have time to build up their income as they work, and then slowly take on the full cost of the lease. So we would pay for 100% of their rent for the first 3 months, typically, and then the youth would take on 10% of that lease every month after that. So within about a year's time, the youth becomes fully independent, taking on the full cost of their lease. And for us, it's important to create that kind of agreement with the landlord, that they have to be able to accept third-party checks, that they understand that we are providing supportive services to the youth, and that, you know, even if a young person doesn't have, for example, a great credit history of rental or employment history, they're still us as a nonprofit, both personally and financially supporting the youth. So in a nutshell, that's what RAP Rehousing is. And if you go to the next slide, I can tell you how we got there and how we continue to use it for college-focused RAP Rehousing. So HOMELESSNESS was founded in the late 80s, early 90s to work predominantly with youth coming from south of the border, from Mexico, from Central America, fleeing a lot of the civil wars in their communities. They weren't able to access any other housing types, and so our founder, who was a priest, said we have to do something about this, and he founded HOMELESSNESS out of his garage in East LA. Since that time, we've continued to grow and serve youth from all over Los Angeles County. LA also attracts youth from all over the country, and so we have a national population, and then we still do work with youth who are immigrating to this country. We've become leaders in LA's homeless field, serving youth, because we've developed a full continuum of care, which I'll explain later. We really invest in you know, solutions, long-term solutions for our youth, to make sure that we can really help them leave homelessness behind for good. And under our current executive director, Andrea Marchetti's leadership, he's been ED since 2010. I started working here in 2008. You know, we've really been able to grow by focusing on creating permanent housing and permanent supportive housing solutions for our youth. So since we've really been leading this agency, we've grown from housing 20 youth in short-term housing in 2010 to over 160 youth throughout all of our continuum on any given night tonight. And, you know, we're really focused in on helping LA develop the coordinated entry system, which is our continuum of care's method of making sure that there's regional leadership and best practices across the board, as well as collaboration and communication between different housing providers and social service agencies across the county, as well as outreach to members in our community. You can go to the next slide. Briefly, we try and make sure that we understand the diverse needs of youth experiencing homelessness, and that we can provide youth with the housing solution that fits that need. And really, you know, from the short term, we offer emergency shelter and transitional housing, all the way to longer term options such as permanent supportive housing. I want to shout out CSH and Sharon's group. They've given us a lot of great technical assistance as we developed our first PSH project. Affordable housing, we purchase houses in our community, and we rent rooms out to youth at $500 a month. Rapid rehousing, as I mentioned, and then other types of support programs such as family reunification. We understand that there's a lot of, you know, sometimes family issues that push youth into homelessness, and we feel that sometimes there is a possible opportunity for that relationship to get repaired. And so we've been connecting through our therapists some youth and their families, and in order to repair that relationship so youth can move back home. We also partner with other organizations in our community both through creating set-aside units in affordable housing complex dedicated to youth, and also, for example, working with a local domestic violence organization to create a crisis housing program in our local hospital. So when survivors of domestic violence are coming to the hospital, they have a safe place to go rather than being discharged into homelessness or back into that situation. You can go to the next slide. So as we started expanding, especially through rapid rehousing, we started to want our youth to do more than just get a minimum wage job. We wanted them to consider going back to school so that they could go up on a career pathway and use the stability of housing as a tool to help them move their lives forward. And so we started approaching our local community colleges just to create more opportunities to take our youth on the campus for tours, et cetera. And that's when a lot of counselors at programs like Guardian Scholars and EOPS started asking us, hey, so you work with homeless youth, can you house our students? And that's when we started learning about the crisis of college student homelessness, especially on community college campuses. Nationwide, about 12% of community college students experience homelessness. And we see the results of that, especially here in California with vulnerable populations like former foster youth, where only 2 to 11% actually graduate from community college or transfer. And in LA, the numbers are really pronounced, where 1 in 5 of LA's community college students experience homelessness. And so without any dorms or real housing support, there isn't really that kind of stability that a lot of students need in order to graduate. You can move forward. And so just looking at students' financial aid letters, this is an example of one of the students that we've worked with, where the college will calculate their financial need as $19,000, but financial aid will only come in at $11,000. So that means that this student has over $7,000 of an unmet need. And that's one of the reasons why it's really hard for, especially our most vulnerable students, to succeed in school, because they're trying to go to school full-time, they're also having to work full-time, and they're oftentimes have a lot of other challenges outside of the classroom that are going unmet. And so what we decided to do is create a program that we call the College Success Initiative, where we can create, as we're working with JBay to really brand as college-focused rapid rehousing. We bring our rapid rehousing program on the community college campuses to connect with students there, and then move them into housing so that they can use that housing as a tool to help them succeed. And you can, next slide. So on the left, you can see what rapid rehousing is, and this is the foundation of what our model is, where we assist with the housing identification, landlord recruitment, we provide the rental subsidies and case management. It's housing first, so it's not about making youth go through shelter or jump through a lot of hoops before moving into their apartments. And it's time limited, as I mentioned, where the rental subsidy gradually decreases. The difference between that rapid rehousing program and our college-focused rapid rehousing is still providing the same housing assistance, rental subsidies, traditional case management of helping youth meet their basic needs and develop their life skills, and a housing first approach. But we want to make sure that this housing support can be more flexible to really meet the needs of a student and gear it towards their graduation date rather than an arbitrary calendar date when the subsidy should end. So that's the flexibility that comes with it. A key portion of it is making sure that we understand how to reach students experiencing homelessness, because they're not the typical students who will come and say, I want come to our shelter program. So we put peer navigators onto community college campuses, and peer navigators are young people, current community college students with lived experience of homelessness, to be our eyes and ears on campus, conduct outreach, and do assessments. And I'll explain that a little bit more. In addition to traditional case management, and that's the role of our key staff, our case managers, we hired an academic specialist to provide academic case management. And that's really, digging into how the students are doing in school. How can we as an agency help students advocate for themselves, navigate the college system, and take advantage of the resources that might be available to them on their college campuses. A lot of the times our students need that kind of hand-holding to learn how to advocate for themselves, and you know, when you get told no by one, you know, person in financial aid, that doesn't always mean it's the end of the conversation. And so we have to make sure that we're also advocating for the students and connecting them with tutoring resources, mentoring programs, and other types of support that go beyond the traditional case management role. And then having a great partnership with our community colleges, because we want them to also be very engaged in this process, host us on campus, understand that, you know, by working to solve student homelessness together, that we can help them achieve their goals of increased graduation and retention rates as well. And also just tap into the huge amount of compassion that we find in the professors, administrators, security guards, everyone that works on community college campuses who wants their students to succeed. Next slide. So again, college-focused rapid rehousing, the core elements are still to provide that rental subsidy and supportive services to homeless students so that they can live on their own, predominantly in the market rate apartments close to campus that we help them succeed or help them identify. Partner with the community colleges so that we can break down the silos where housing programs aren't talking to the community colleges and community colleges aren't talking to the housing programs, or being integrated with the local continuum of care to identify resources and housing support for students experiencing homelessness. Provide a peer navigator to conduct outreach and assessment on campus, and then connect youth with housing, and then provide the academic case management to students that we're housing in our program and that we've referred to other agencies as well, so that housing truly does become that kind of a tool that helps students graduate. Next slide. And so this is an example of one of our partners, Rio Hondo College. You know, they have a lot of on-campus resources such as the Student Life Program, Associated Students, Guardian Scholars, and even a Food Insecurity Task Force, because we see that as prevalent as homelessness is on community college campuses, so is hunger. But, you know, we are working with Rio Hondo so that they can expand their network of off-campus and community partners, such as us, the LA County Department of Social Services, organizations that primarily work with food insecurity, and also our local elected officials. And so, you know, this is just an example of the ways that we were able to create a partnership with the school, both at the administrative level and also with various professors and staff on campus to make sure that we're able to outreach and meet students. Next slide. Our peer navigators are, I mean, they're just amazing young people. We have 3 peer navigators. Each is positioned at a different community college campus where they're co-located. Sarai, Brianna, and Celestina. They're all community college students with lived experience of homelessness. So we met them through our own outreach on college campuses. We were able to connect them with housing within our program or within that of one of our partnering agencies. And then we were able to offer them a job, 20 hours a week, where they're co-located at community college, either at the EOPS office, financial aid office, or even at Rio Hondo's situation. We have her placed in their food pantry to meet students who are experiencing food and housing insecurity. They connect students with our housing opportunities by providing the Next Step tool, which is our local continuum of care's basic assessment for youth experiencing homelessness. So this gets them into our HMIS system, where we can identify what their housing needs are, still identify what the best resources for them are, and get them engaged with CES. And so our role as a regional coordinator in CES allows us to really leverage all of the resources that are within the COC, but bring those also onto community college campuses, while still making sure that we're connecting youth who aren't in community college with all of the resources through our partner connections, through different places that we do outreach, such as the DCFS office in our community, and then engaging with, you know, local stakeholders like faith-based organizations who do a lot of amazing work and support a lot of youth in need. And so by having our presence both on the community college campuses and, you know, coordination through the CES program, we're really able to bridge the gap for students experiencing homelessness. And our peer navigators, you know, a lot of times students have a lot of stigmas attached to homelessness. They say, oh, I don't identify with the person on Skid Row. I don't want to say that I'm homeless, even if they're sleeping in their car, they're couch surfing, or even sleeping on campus and using the showers and facilities there. So we found that by having a young person as that point person on community college, we're able to really connect with youth in a very effective way, break down a lot of the stigmas, because they're the person that they're meeting first from our agency is someone who's been through it that they can relate to. You know, it really helps us connect with youth in a very meaningful way to get them to, you know, say it's okay to ask for help. I've seen that someone else has gone through this program and it's really helped them out. And for our peer navigators, it gives them a great opportunity to give back, have real work experience within a system that they're very interested in, and be lead and develop their own leadership. And so we're really proud of the work our peer navigators do. The one in the middle, Brianna, just actually graduated from East LA College, and she's transferring to Cal State Dominguez Hills. And so, you know, it's really amazing to see the kind of ways that, you know, we were able to house her, and then she was able to graduate, and she's still able to connect more students to the housing that they need. Next slide. So the goals for our College Success Initiative are really to help students obtain their AA degree or professional certification, transfer to a four-year college, because we know that community college grads earn over $400,000 more over their lifetime than someone without a degree. And it's also just continuing to provide that support and personalized relationship. You'll see that, you know, a lot of young people need positive relationships in their lives, especially if they've been experiencing homelessness. And so that's really one of the main focus that our case managers are able to provide, is for someone who's got their back and is a cheerleader for them, and, you know, develop that kind of family relationship and bring additional resources to our youth. You can, next slide. And so, you know, we have limited time today, but I really encourage you all to go and watch the story of Kashana. She's an amazing young person, a former foster youth that we were able to house through our College Success Initiative. She's actually writing a book called DNA Exchange, The Pain of a Foster Child, and it should be published, self-published in within the next couple months. And the video is available both at the link below and also on our website, hovenesinc.org. Just 3 minutes. It's an amazing story. I hope you guys can watch it sometime and be inspired, but you can go to the next slide. And so since we've launched the College Success Initiative in August 2016, we've housed 47 students, and 12 of those students have already graduated or transferred onto four-year institutions. We initially were housing students from about 7 different community colleges across the county, but since we really have grown through coordinated entry system, when we have a defined service area of all of southeastern Los Angeles County, we've really focused in CSI just on those 3 colleges, plus, you know, a lot of referrals from LA Trade Tech. But predominantly, we're housing students from East LA College, Rio Hondo College, and Cerritos College. And we're really, you know, trying to make sure that we have deep and meaningful relationships within those community colleges so that we can learn more about student homelessness, advocate for more resources for students experiencing homelessness, and develop more housing opportunities. This fall, we should actually be able to break ground on one of our next housing developments. It's going to be 8 units of affordable housing located here in Boyle Heights. We identified a spot of land that was owned by the city and vacant for 14 years. So by working with the city to obtain the land for free, we can do permanent housing at a fraction of the cost and time as it would take compared to traditional affordable housing developments. Half of the units are going to be for students experiencing homelessness, and half of the students are going to be for youth with more mental health challenges. So it's kind of a mix between PSH and the college dorm. And so we're really excited about using this as a model to continue to expand and grow that will complement the rapid rehousing, the college-focused rapid rehousing throughout our own internal continuum, and serve as a model for how do we, you know, reimagine what we can do with land development, and not only wait for sites that are 25 to 50 units that can take years and years to develop, but we have opportunities to do things really quickly, as these ones are coming in at about $110,000 per unit, as compared to traditional affordable housing, which can be anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000 per unit. And so we're really excited about our College Success Initiative and College Focused Rapid Rehousing. We want to make sure that we're advocating for HEAP funding to be used for youth. Just yesterday, I was at the LA City Council meeting as they were discussing HEAP funding, and they decided to allocate just, the minimum 5% for youth experiencing homelessness. I was there to say that our youth deserve more than our minimum effort and minimum funding. And so that's why it's really important for us as service providers to make sure that we're in contact with our COCs as HEAP is rolled out to advocate for, both to ensure that that 5% is really getting directed towards youth, but to show that there are innovative and effective strategies that are keeping youth housed, keeping them in school, helping them really leave homelessness behind for good so that we can prevent them from becoming the next wave of chronically homeless adults in our community. And so that's in a nutshell of what we are doing with College Focused Rapid Rehousing, but it's been exciting over the last couple of years to see how we continue to grow our own internal continuum of care to make sure that we're housing youth across the board, meeting new populations that have been historically underserved, and still doing a lot of the work with the traditional homeless youth populations, such as those with more mental health challenges who require PSH. Undocumented youth still need housing support and our focus and compassion, and then youth with more of just the economic challenges and personal challenges that a lot of the youth throughout California are facing. So thanks again. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Eric. We really appreciate it. I hope those of you who are listening, we find this very intentional combination of a classic housing intervention, which is rapid rehousing, with being that connective tissue to a well-resourced and well-developed network of support in higher education. So not replicating it, doing what they do well, and really leveraging that. I know we have a lot of people from the community colleges who are on the web seminar, and we're very excited about working with HOMELESSNESS, and we're going to be working over the next year to hopefully replicate this college-focused rapid rehousing using HEAP funding in multiple jurisdictions to understand how do we make that connection so that the end of homelessness is actually a long-term economic security that can be achieved through higher education. So we're also delighted to turn next to Sharon Report, who's going to talk about supportive housing, how HEAP funding can be used for supportive housing for youth. Again, this is, for some wasn't, the go-to is kind of like shelter, right? But how do we actually think about shelter and beyond shelter about the whole continuum of housing needs of homeless youth? So thank you, Sharon, for being on today's web seminar.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, everybody. As Amy said, I'm Sharon Report, and I work on state policy around homelessness for the Corporation for Supportive Housing. CSH is a national nonprofit and community development financial institution working to end homelessness. So as Amy said, I'm on the call to talk about supportive housing for youth, and I'm just going to give a very broad definition, and then I'll go into each of these boxes you see on your screen in a little bit more detail. Using the Housing First approach, supportive housing is an affordable place to live, along with intensive, culturally competent, voluntary wraparound services that are designed to promote housing stability and connect youth to whatever other services they may need. And I think the biggest difference between rapid rehousing that Eric was talking about and supportive housing is that the rental assistance does not end, so it's often a longer term, not always longer term rental assistance, but it doesn't have a time limit. And then the other piece is just the level of services that tenants receive in the housing is usually very intensive. In creating supportive housing for youth, services are particularly a critical component. So designing the right services package can make the difference in allowing the tenant to remain stably housed or falling back into homelessness. Supportive housing can take the shape of private market rental housing, just as Eric was describing rapid rehousing. It also can be shared housing. Housing providers can use master lease housing where A housing provider will lease a bunch of units from a private market landlord, and then the housing provider will sublet those units to youth. And then finally, what I think most of us think of as supportive housing is a single supportive housing site. So those are all within the realm of supportive housing. Next slide, please. So for older adults, supportive housing is typically thought of as for people experiencing significant barriers to housing stability, such as chronic homelessness, people with disabilities who are frequent hospital users or jail users. But for youth, supportive housing is an appropriate intervention for people with disabilities who have repeatedly experienced homelessness, maybe throughout their lives as children and as adults, youth who have been involved in the juvenile justice system and have a disability, and youth with other indicators of prolonged housing instability. Just as not all youth will succeed with rapid rehousing or transitional housing, not all youth need supportive housing. Supportive housing should be one intervention in a coordinated response to youth homelessness, as Amy mentioned. So we do typically urge communities to adopt best practices identified in HUD's Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, and then to use resources that are on the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness website, guidebooks produced by HUD that are also on the U.S. ICH website, and were created to help communities plan a coordinated response. Youth with lived experience of homelessness should be part of this planning process, along with mainstream education, court and legal, and child welfare systems. And as Eric mentioned several times, in Los Angeles, we do have a youth-specific coordinated entry system. And we do think that these systems are cropping up throughout the country, and that they provide really important tools to be able to assess each youth's need for different housing interventions, to prioritize youth with the greatest vulnerabilities for supportive housing, and also to match youth to housing existing in that community through a coordinated referral process. HEAP cannot be used for planning, but the California Emergency Solutions and Housing Program, referred to as CASH, that's administered through the state's Housing and Community Development Department, can be used to do the work of planning for your community's response to youth experiencing homelessness. And we're really encouraging communities to coordinate the various sources of funding that we're so lucky to have available to us now. And using HEAP is just part of that coordinated response. HEAP can fund creating youth-specific housing, as Jenny mentioned, and as well as funding housing navigation for youth that might be part of a coordinated entry system. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, supportive housing combines affordable housing with services that help people who face the most complex challenges to live with stability, autonomy, and dignity. Tenants in supportive housing live in housing that is affordable to youth in deep poverty, and these tenants typically pay 30% of their incomes on rent, and in many cases that means that they're paying zero, because if they have zero income, they'd be paying zero rent. One of the goals of supportive housing as well as rapid rehousing is to increase the tenant's income over time. The housing is permanent, meaning it does not limit length of stay, and often when I talk about permanency, people sometimes freak out because I hear lots of concerns about allowing young people to remain dependent on rental subsidies forever. However, permanency doesn't mean the tenant lives in the housing forever or even relies on subsidies forever. As I mentioned, one of the goals of supportive housing for youth is to increase their employment opportunities as well as their income, their access to benefits, their access to education. Most supportive housing tenants move out within 3 years, which is the same average length of stay for any Californian renting. Data shows many tenants need a sense of permanency to stabilize. For youth who have faced often a lifetime of instability and homelessness as children, or other significant barriers to housing stability, permanency allows the tenants to feel a sense of that sense of stability. And most importantly, tenants are never required to return to homelessness because their tenancy or their rental assistance ends. Many communities have developed moving on initiatives that do help tenants who do not and any longer need the intense supportive services to move on to other permanent housing opportunities. In supportive housing, supportive services providers actively engage tenants in flexible, voluntary, and comprehensive services, and they work with property and housing management to support tenant stability and ensure that the housing remains a positive community asset for the long term. So some of these services can range from helping the tenant learn to be a good neighbor and tenant, engaging the tenant in community building activities, life skills training, teaching the tenant to shop and cook, and connecting the tenant to behavioral health and medical treatment. Next slide, please. HEAP and other new funding sources can be used to fund supportive housing, as Jenny mentioned. To build new projects for youth, we typically talk about needing three legs of the stool: capital funding to build the housing, operating subsidies to pay for the operating costs of the building, and funding for the services offered in supportive housing. Supportive housing can, however, work with just two legs. Again, as I mentioned, a housing provider can offer rental assistance to private market landlords or to master lease multiple apartments owned by private market landlords. HEAP can fund a number of these activities. It can fund a capitalized operating reserve for a supportive housing apartment, and this is kind of a unique and complicated a tool that we have in California and other programs that are more for older adults. But with a capitalized operating reserve, a COC working with a community development agency can offer developers a big chunk of money up front to pay for operating costs of an existing or newly opening supportive housing unit. The developer then draws on that reserve over 15 years or so to pay for the ongoing operating costs. And because the money is contracted, obligated, and spent up front, it is within an allowable use of HEAP, as well as cash. It's specifically called out in cash. HEAP can pay for moving costs for supportive housing, and it can pay for a short period of rental assistance as well. It can pay for capital costs of developing supportive housing for youth, as long as the money is spent by June of 2021, as Jenny mentioned. And that really means that the funding cannot be used to provide capital funding from the start of a project to the end of a project. But it can be used to pay for pre-development costs, like acquiring a site or architectural plans, drawing up architectural plans, or development of costs of a project that has already begun construction and just needs to fill a gap in funding. For example, to pay in an affordable housing project to add funding to make it a supportive housing unit specifically for youth. And it can pay for services costs for the first couple of years of a supportive housing program, or even for a capitalized services reserve, where again, a developer or housing provider is drawing off of a reserve to pay for services over long term. And HCD has used this capitalized operating reserve concept in multiple programs and will be using that for No Place Like Home as well. It can also generate seed money for supportive housing that can leverage other local or federal fund investment in housing for young adults. And I did list on this slide several other programs that can be leveraged to help generate enough funding to pay for supportive housing. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, key to supportive housing is the housing first approach. Housing is really not considered supportive housing, excuse me, unless it follows those key principles. because, as Amy and Jenny mentioned, HEAP requires following core components of Housing First. Supportive housing fits in nicely to the HEAP program. One of the first tenets of Housing First is that the resident should be at the center of the services plan. This means that supportive housing tenants are not required to follow a predetermined program, but work with the services provider to determine what services the tenant needs. Youth experiencing homelessness should be connected to housing as quickly as possible, as housing is a necessary first step in making the services effective. Studies show services are only effective in achieving any improvements in health, employment, or income outcomes when that individual is housed. So getting that individual housed is a key focus of somebody still experiencing homelessness. Services should be intensive with assertive engagement. So rather than waiting for youth to come to the services provider is tasked with using all evidence-based models of engagement to engage the tenant to want to participate in the services. While the services provider is required to offer services, a services or housing provider does not require the tenants to participate in services. This means that the tenant cannot lose their housing or be denied housing based on their agreement to participate in services. This principle follows from evidence showing that tenants, including youth, are more likely to participate in services when not required to do so. Sometimes this seems a little counterintuitive to us. Sometimes I think we believe that if we force people to participate in services, they're more likely to participate. But the evidence actually shows the opposite, and new emerging evidence is showing that that is true for youth even more so than it is for older adults. Additionally, given the instability and vulnerability of people, including youth, living in supportive housing, who are often distrustful of systems, denying or removing housing from this vulnerable population based on noncompliance with services requirements typically means that those tenants return to homelessness and will eventually become chronically homeless adults. Youth who are experiencing homelessness are 5 times more likely to become chronically homeless adults than youth who are stably housed. And for this population who are eligible to live in supportive housing, that likelihood increases significantly. Similarly, tenants do not lose their housing if they're using drugs or alcohol. Tenants can be evicted if not following the terms of a lease, but like you or I, they are not evicted for failing to follow program rules like sobriety. Instead, they are offered evidence-based treatment tailored to meet their unique needs, and this may mean harm reduction, and it can mean abstinence. It depends on that tenant's needs. Tenants sign leases and are subject to the rights and responsibilities of tenancy. Next slide, please. Finally, Housing First embraces a low-barrier approach where tenants are not excluded for drug or alcohol use, for noncompliance with treatment or medication, or because of a history of eviction, arrests, or convictions, or poor credit. Remember, supportive housing is intended to serve youth who would otherwise not be able to live stably without the long-term mental assistance and intensive services that supportive housing offers. This often means that youth come with histories of instability, incarceration, run-ins with the law, multiple arrests, and noncompliance with treatment. And those youth should be welcomed, not excluded, because this is the population that supportive housing is intended to serve. When following the Housing First model, supportive housing is highly successful for youth. Youth are able to stabilize, increase their income, and improve their health outcomes. And over 90% do not return to homelessness, despite being otherwise highly vulnerable to years of homelessness as older adults. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. I'll turn it back to you now, Amy.
Thank you very much, Sharon. We really appreciate it. Now, from here, we've heard, 2 of many great models that we're hoping those of you who are on the call are excited about going out and applying on HEAP behalf of. And so now it's my job to kind of break it down. We're getting lots to break it down. How do I get this money? How do we get this money? So I'm going to lay out a few simple steps. It's never as simple as this, I know, but at least this can give you some traction. So over the course of the presentation, you've heard the word continuum of care and large city. The HCFC, the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council, is accepting applications from these entities. These entities are then going to subgrant that money out locally. And so the number one thing you need to do if you are a community college, if you're a nonprofit provider, no matter where you are, is figure out what is going in your local community by making contact with your continuum of care. Different things are happening all around the state. I know that in the County of Los Angeles, they have a county process, and then for their large city application, they have a set of priorities as well. And so go and make contact with that continuum of care. We have 43 in California, and sometimes some of them, just to make things more complicated, they're organized differently in different places. Some of them have almost a nonprofit that coordinates the different entities, that coordinates their application to HUD. Other ones don't have that. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, but what we do have on our website is the contacts for the 43 continuums of care. And when I put that bullet there, call, ask questions, ask them a different way, ask them a third way, and if you still aren't getting any answers, give us a call. We're happy to try and ferret out the local process to understand what's going on. The first step, again, is going to be these entities getting the state money. Then they're going to have to turn around and push it out in the community. It's my guess that that's going to be a much more time-consuming process. But as Jenny said in the beginning, there's very hard stops on when this money has to be contracted and spent. And so really it's in all of our interest to move quickly, because the best way to make the case for more funding for homeless youth is to make sure we're using all of the existing funding. So that's my first thing to implore is find your continuum of care, see where they are in their process in terms of setting their priorities, find out the person if they're having community stakeholder meetings, and kind of and plug yourself in as soon as possible. This money is definitely not going to come to you. You're going to have to go to it. So the next step is really find out how many unaccompanied homeless youth were in your 2017 point in time count. As Jenny said at the beginning of the presentation, 5% is a floor. It is not a ceiling. And so what you want to do is go and determine in your local continuum of care what, for lack of a better term, should be going to homeless youth. We know the issue of youth homelessness has been chronically underinvested in. You can see here the numbers. We have of our 132,278 homeless individuals in the 2017 point in time count, 15,458 were identified as unaccompanied youth under 18, plus unaccompanied youth 18 to 24. That is 12%. Now, we could have long, complex, and interesting conversations about whether that figure is correct, but that point in time count is the number that's statutorily required to be used in the HEAP program. And so it's a very excellent foothold in your conversations to try and say, yes, I know 5% is the minimum, but did you know that in our jurisdiction, this is the reality of homeless youth? And that really leads, and if you want those point in time numbers, those are also available on our website. They're available on the HUD website. This is not secret information. And anyone who's having any problem ferreting that out, please give us a call. We're happy to help. The next step in the process is calculate, from what Jenny has said, you know how much the large cities are getting, and then you know how much the continuums of care are getting through the other pots. Calculate what should go to homeless youth based on the reality in your community, and really step out there and make the case for more than the 5% minimum. HUD has largely prioritized chronic homelessness and homelessness among veterans, and those are extremely needy populations. But I'd be lying if I didn't say it's somewhat at the expense of homeless youth. We have very limited funding available to address youth homelessness. We now, fortunately, have this 5% minimum, but there's a very strong case for it being more than 5%. The only way your elected officials can know that if you go and make the case to them. And really, those numbers are undercounts. There's much more accurate, newly available data about the prevalence of homeless youth, which finds that 1 in 30 youth under 18 experience homelessness in a 12-month period, and 1 in 10 18 to 24-year-olds. So the numbers in the point-in-time count are really minimums, I would say. So let's make sure that your communities at least get that. And then really emphasize, for some people, they think of homeless youth and they think, well, they're young and they're strong and they can live outside and it won't hurt them as much. I mean, who knows what? Or they have these images of the traveling young person who wants to be homeless. If you need a new door to enter this conversation, raise this issue of homelessness among college students. People who may not have as much empathy or awareness of the issue of youth homelessness generally, when they hear that 1 in 10 students in LAC Community College District experienced homelessness, that is sometimes something that can resonate. It's just another piece of information to bring forward to help them understand that homeless youth are not someone else. They are our young people. They are young people in college. They are our children. It's just a way of edging your way into the conversation if you're finding that your local jurisdiction is not interested in spending more than the 5% minimum. All right, next step in this process is consider partnering. So a lot of the questions we've gotten is, I'm a community college, how do I get this money? You're probably going to have to partner. The pro side of HEAP is the money is getting, distributed very quickly, but that's not to your advantage if you don't have an existing relationship with your continuum of care. So once you find your continuum of care and you see kind of the continuum of organizations that are funded by it, if it were me and if I were in your position, I would strike up a partnership. I would reach out to a HOMELESSNESS or many of the other wonderful organizations around the state that are funded through their continuums of care and say, let's go in on something together to address the issues that we're seeing, whether it be in our community or on our campus. This is a good way to get your dip your toe into the water of funding distributed through your continuum of care. And don't let the best be the enemy of the good. I mean, I feel like that's a saying that always rings true. Maybe it's not going to be, maybe it's a little, off kilter this time, but at least push in there and kind of live to fight another day. So that is really, these partnerships can be a way to quickly operationalize something much more than forging a new relationship, which, as we all know, takes a lot of time. So if you're one of those entities who're like, that sounds good to me, I just need to find the entity, again, contact us. We will do our best to help you connect with those homeless youth providers who are likely going to be stepping forward and want to, and may be getting funding, and they may be amenable to some kinds of partnership. Last one is review that NOFA. I mean, the HCFC has really been amazing in terms of pushing this information out in a very timely basis. So job one is to subscribe to their notices. You'll be on top of everything they have to share, all the information they have to share. And then we've done our best to collect information on a HEAP implementation page. That is where we have looked at there's a quick fact sheet, some FAQs, the continuum of care contacts, this calculation of funding, where we looked at all of the unaccompanied youth over the total number of homeless individuals in your continuum of care, as well as the SB 850 language. I mean, SB 850 is not 2,000 pages long. It's a very succinct bill. And if you can read it and you can say to your local decision makers, here is exactly where it says in the state law, that's a very powerful a very powerful way, because often it's like, well, I heard about this, I'm not really sure, but SB 850 is one of those where you don't have to be an expert It's very simply written, it's very simply put, and it's actually quite succinct. So go there, follow the link, and become your own local expert in the implementation of this, because we are delighted to play whatever role we can, but our organization and no other organization can do the job that you can do in your local communities advocating for homeless youth to receive HEAP funding. The last thing I'm going to say before we move over to question and answer is this program does relate to a bill that recently passed out of the California State Legislature, the Senate Bill 918. And this is it started in one iteration. It's in a very different iteration as it moves its way to the governor's desk. And yet what it really is, it begins to set state policy for how we're going to address youth homelessness. Prior to the passage of this legislation, which now is making its way to the governor's desk, California had no, and still doesn't until it's signed, really coherent set of goals and outcome measures around youth homelessness. And so this is a very important first step in addressing youth homelessness. And so if you're on the call, we'd appreciate it if you would send us a letter requesting Governor Brown to sign the legislation. It is not it's a step in the process, I'll say that. But when we take that step forward, it allows us to take the next step forward. And so in our follow-up email, we will send a sample support letter. So thank you, everyone, for being so patient as you have heard about these great models and this great information. And let's start by turning to Ginny and asking a lot of questions about HEAP. And so keep them coming in, because we're going to try and do this kind of as rapid fire as possible so that we get through the dozens and dozens. Probably won't get through dozens and dozens, but we'll get through the ones that were most frequently asked. So Ginny, one question is, how much funding is allocated for round 2?
That's a great question. We don't know how much funding will be allocated for round 2, because round 2 will consist of the funding that has not been applied for and allocated in round 1. We're really recommending, as I mentioned, that COCs and cities, the large cities, apply for funding in round 1, because any funds that are not applied for and allocated in round 1 will be reallocated amongst the entire pool of cities and COCs in round 2. So it will be a lesser share of the funding.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like you say, get out there, let's get them in. Let's not wait to have the perfect plan, but actually put your marker down in round 1. So another one, Jenny.
That's what we are recommending.
Okay. So I think I know the answer to this, but Jenny, will these funds, are they able to be used for emergency housing, hotel assistance, one-time uses such as furniture?
Absolutely. Anything that can be directly linked to providing assistance to individuals or families that are homeless is an eligible use.
Thank you. So one is going back to the shelter crisis determination. What constitutes a shelter crisis? What does that determination mean?
That's a really good question. As I understand it, it alleviates some of the current sort of regulations and requirements within a jurisdiction to make it easier for them to provide shelter. But again, I'm not an expert on that. It is in statute, and our recommendation is that that people turn to their local jurisdiction and ask what the implications are locally for a particular COC or city or county. Okay.
So I think the number of questions kind of circle around, we use continuum of care in child welfare for a whole different, it's a whole different thing. And so we have people on the web seminar who are in higher education, child welfare, housing, and homelessness. And so can you please explain, who are the entities that apply for the HEAP funding?
Sure, and it is confusing. I know exactly why people are confused. The continuum of care term is a term of art that actually I think came from HUD, the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department, because it's how they have chosen to allocate funds for homelessness. But it varies. As you said, Amy, there are 43 COCs throughout California, and they do differ. They all are required to have an administrative entity that receives and is responsible for managing and overseeing the use of funding. But in some COCs, that administrative entity will be a city housing department or a county office, while in others it can be a nonprofit organization or an organization that has been created specifically for the purpose of being the administrative entity for a COC.
Thank you,
I hope
Jenny.
that helps.
It absolutely does help. The reality is, many organizations on this Web Summit, you may access this funding, you may not, but if you make a meaningful connection with your local continuum of care, you've achieved something. So that's not we're hoping for even more, but if you're participating and you're not actively engaged with that, again, that's where the billions of dollars that HUD has gets pushed out to local communities. And so, we hope that you can make a connection and get funding now, but that money is going to keep on coming down the pike. And so whether it's to make referrals for the people that you serve, or whether it's to actively partner in administering programs. So Jenny, another one, can HEAP funding be used to assist homeless minors?
Absolutely. The homeless youth set aside includes homeless minors, and any homeless minor is also eligible for HEAP funding that may not be specifically allocated for homeless youth, but definitely eligible.
Right. So if someone is, with a shelter for minors, this could be something that they could use to either add a service or to enrich their programming in some way.
That's correct.
That's great to hear.
Amy, can I just chime in with one addition to that?
Absolutely.
So people understand. I think to satisfy the 5% requirement, the individuals and families being served have to be unaccompanied. So I just thought I'd clarify that because there are many minors who are homeless, but they're with their parents or other family members who are adults, and we're really talking about unaccompanied minors or young adults.
Thanks, Sharon. That's an important clarification. Thank you.
Absolutely. And when you go to your point in time count, if you're looking at trying to figure it out, there's two categories of unaccompanied homeless youth: unaccompanied minors and unaccompanied individuals 18 to 24. The total, in terms of the proportion, is the addition of those. There's also, as Sharon was saying, there's minors in families, but what we're really trying to do is to make sure that homeless youth who have long been overlooked are getting their fair share, that they have a seat at the table. Not that they're more important, but they are important. So I'm going to turn just a little bit over to you, Eric, and ask a few quick questions about rapid rehousing. One is, Eric, what's the average time of support that college-focused rapid rehousing provides? How long do you work with students?
Yeah, we it's a hybrid model because we use the public funding for especially the first 12 months that we're working with the student. And then we try and bridge in private support from foundations or different donors that we have to continue to provide that rental support up until the student's graduation date. And so it's a program that we're still continuing to develop, but traditionally the rapid rehousing model allows us to work with students for 12 months. Students have, a real consistent income stream between financial aid, a lot of times part-time employment or work study, and then the rental subsidy. So we can calculate how long we can extend that subsidy based off of the student need, but our goal is to really, instead of having students stay in community college for 6 years, really get them to that graduation date within that 2-year period. That would be ideal. And also because we're working with students who are coming in sometimes in their first semester or sometimes in their last semester, it really varies. But our goal is to really develop this program and continue to develop it in a way that allows us the maximum amount of flexibility to support students for the time that they're in college and helps them get a healthy transition into stability also once they graduate. So that when they graduate, it doesn't mean it's the end of the support, but it's really time for us to ramp it down and start looking at the ways that the youth can really become self-sufficient after that.
Thank you, Eric. Jenny, this one's for you. Can the funding be used for homeless youth food insecurity?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Can HEAP funding be used to address food insecurity among homeless youth?
Absolutely. Again, the categories are deliberately broad, and we haven't defined eligible uses in specific terms to provide flexibility for exactly those kinds of supports and services if a COC or city determines that's where the priorities are.
That's great to hear. Here's a college that are saying, you know, is rapid rehousing in all communities? I'll address this to you, Sharon, as someone who knows a lot about what's going on all corners of our state. And if they want to partner with an organization like HOMELESSNESS or others who get HUD funding for rapid rehousing, what guidance would you offer them?
Yeah, great question. So rapid rehousing is not in every single community in the state. There are some COCs that get very little funding for either by HUD or the state for any kind of interventions, including rapid rehousing. However, in most cities or most COCs, most COCs do get some funding for rapid rehousing, either through the state. We do have a California Emergency Solutions Program, grant program, ESG, that offers funding for rapid rehousing, and then federal funds offers funding for rapid rehousing in most places in California. So I do think, again, you know, going back to Amy's point that you've made several times, Amy, about connecting with the COCs, that is critically important to trying to access funding for rapid rehousing or to connect to providers who are already offering rapid rehousing to, usually it's to families or single adults experiencing homelessness, and really trying to connect with those providers that are already using rapid rehousing as an intervention for other populations. I do think there aren't a lot of homeless youth providers who are doing rapid rehousing at this point, but in some jurisdictions there are a number of them, like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and some other Bay Area cities and counties. So my suggestion would be to really, again, try and get involved in that COC process for how the funding should be used, and really try and connect with providers who are already doing rapid rehousing for other populations.
Thank you very much, Sharon. This question is for you, Eric, about the peer navigators and academic case managers. Are they paid or do they volunteer?
They're paid. They're paid as a part-time position at 20 hours a week.
Great. Awesome. Another question that we have that I have for you, Jenny. So it sounds like 2 large cities, their applications are already in, and then there's timelines around the money getting contracted. So when HCFC uses the word contracted, is that considered spent once it's legally obligated? Like, do the services, is that 2021 deadline when all of the kind of money has to be spent, or when is that really the deadline by which all contracts need to be executed? So trying to understand that distinction between spending money and contracting.
Right, and this is one place where the statute is a little unclear because it uses the same term for both. The final landing place on this is that for the first deadline, the 50% deadline is contractually obligated, but the second deadline, the June 30th, 2021 deadline, is a requirement that funds be actually spent, not just contractually obligated.
Okay, thank you very much. We got a few more questions. I know we're kind of bumping up against our time. One is, Ginny, as we round out the hour, you are in an amazing vantage point in terms of a deep, lengthy knowledge and experience with homeless youth, and now in your role under an exciting new state-funded program. What guidance would you give, homeless youth providers who have been really, slogging away for years, trying to kind of keep programs alive and grow them? What, from your vantage point, would be the smart path forward in terms of really, integrating them into this new large public funding source?
Well, that's a great question. And Amy, I think your steps really outline the right approach. I think the most important thing, as you said, is for homeless youth providers and advocates to connect with the COCs and large cities, if that's the case, to make sure that they've got a seat at that collaborative table. COCs are designed to be collaborative bodies that include a variety of service providers and advocates and housing developers that are engaged in addressing homelessness. And so being part of that conversation and part of that collaborative is really going to be the most effective way to participate, at least for the HEAP program. That's really the key. I hope that helps. I think, it's also the case for HUD funds because, again, as you said, the COCs are really the receiving body of all of the funding that comes down from the federal government.
Thank you. So that will appreciate that. And now I want to turn to Sharon. I mean, it's a very tight timeline on HEAP, and yet you've really peaked. I'm also already very interested in permanent supportive housing, but what guidance would you give, Sharon, given that this money is coming out fast, to be directed towards that use? Anything, if you were in that situation to really need to operationalize it locally, what advice do you have for people who are out there trying to make it happen?
Well, I think several things. I urge your COC to also apply for cash, and I'm assuming that COCs that are accessing the HEAP money will also be applying for cash, because that is all of that money is going to COCs. That is not a lot of money, but it is probably enough for a lot of jurisdictions to do some planning, and it will be available around the same time as HEAP. So the applications for that program to receive an allocation in November are due at the end of this month. So it's also a very quick timeline, unfortunately, and fortunately, I guess. But I would say to anybody looking at this fund, HEAP, to also look at that and see if your COC can access cash to enhance the allocation you're receiving, and with cash you can do some planning. So if your community does not have any kind of planning or coordinated entry system for youth, cash is a good source of funding for that. Because HEAP has to be used so quickly and has to be applied for so quickly, I would suggest looking at what your community has now. If there are homeless youth providers who are using some effective models for getting people out of homelessness, allow them to exit homelessness and access some housing that they could remain in permanently or for the next couple of years, then I would recommend partnering with those providers to really try and get a program up and running that's going to be a good model for maybe future endeavors that your community wants to do. You could be looking at a new model of housing and services for this population with HEAP. It's just that it might be hard to ramp up in time to obligate and spend the money by June 2021. So I guess I would say with HEAP and and with any of the other programs that are coming out right now, I would urge the COCs to look at every resource available to your community. As Jenny said, HEAP does require collaboration with other city and county entities, and so I strongly recommend trying to partner with those communities, with those entities, those jurisdictions, to try and maximize how HEAP is leveraged, and then to look at existing programs to maybe use HEAP to enhance programs that are working well, and then use other sources of funding to really do planning and build on the successes and challenges that you've had in your community with serving this population.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And that's a great segue. There's a lot of interest and excitement about this program and other recent state investments. There are 2 web seminars that are coming up. One is being sponsored by the California Coalition for Youth, that's going to be providing additional information about HEAP. I think, lots of us are excited about bringing this information out into the community, and so we'll include information about that in the follow-up materials. And then Housing California and Corporation for Supportive Housing are doing a educational opportunity that's going to be on even a broader set of funding opportunities. Sometimes it can feel like information overload, but I do promise you it's worth the time and effort to try and navigate these waters. So much of our work, we're siloed. We're in higher education, we're in housing and homelessness, or we're in child welfare. This recent state investment is a real opportunity to transcend those. But it takes some time to figure that out, and it takes some time to kind of see how it's all playing out at the local level. So with that, I just do want to thank everyone for hanging in there. This was a longer one than usual. Usually we try and keep ours to about an hour. So if you're still listening, we do appreciate your patience. We absolutely appreciate the time. Jenny Puttyfoot, Executive Director of the Homelessness Coordinating and Financing Council, Eric Hubbard with Homelessness Inc., and Sharon Report with the Corporation for Supportive Housing. So we'll send out those follow-up materials, and just want to thank everyone again for being on today's web seminar. This concludes today's web seminar. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.